This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, special guest Chandler Saunders joins me and Joey to talk about what we expect from Dad and the accountability of companies.
Woo! I'm never gonna dance again. These guilty feet have got no podcast. This is what a Joey sounds like.
Guilty feet?
Yeah. I was gonna lean further into the metaphor, but who you were just hearing is executive producer and head of the woodwind section, Jess Vander.
Hi, this is Jess. Actually, I'd like to say it's the strings or percussion, but we'll take woodwind. Woodwind. You know what my favorite woodwind instrument is?
What?
The bassoon. Is that true? I don't know.
I don't know. And we also have today a special guest and smooth operator, Chandler Saunders.
Wow. I didn't know what to expect there, but I'll take it. I'll be a smooth operator.
Can you live up to that? I mean, I gave Jess the head of the woodwinds, but you were actually a woodwind player. So, I mean, we basically have an orchestra. A saxophone
is not a woodwind. It's brass.
Oh, how contraire.
It's a reeded instrument. It's a woodwind.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, I just corrections departmented myself. No, you actually did corrections department. Wow, this is... Wait a minute. But a horn, definitely brass. A trombone, definitely brass. Trumpet, brass. Sax?
Woodwind.
And fun fact about your little bassoon there, it's a double reeded woodwind. So that means there's two little tiny reeds that vibrate. That's how it makes the sound.
Oh, look at this. How cool is that?
Look at us.
Wait, a flute is also technically a woodwind?
Maybe because it doesn't have whatever the mouthpiece of the brass instruments are called. I have no idea.
And maybe back in the day it was made of wood, but now it's not. So for historical reasons, it's still part of the family. They just didn't want to exile it because it just already felt like it was just one of us.
But, yeah. They're like, you're on our team. It's fine that you're made of metal now. That's nice.
Wow. We learn so much every day.
The woodwinds are such an inclusive group. Do we have any housekeeping, Jess?
No.
The house is clean, as always. We're doing great. YouTube has our show with closed captioning for accessible listening. That's the housekeeping.
Wait, what is a bagpipe?
Well, I think a lot of this naming is based on the blowing method. So maybe the mouthpiece. So maybe it fits in a woodwind? I have no idea.
Probably a woodwind. Okay, we digress.
So let's hit the first topic. I got some stuff for you.
Great.
Could be hot, could be not. I don't know. So there's been some parental conversations swirling around in my life, both, in the media as well as some more personal things. My sister's pregnant who listens to the show. Aww. Jillian, congratulations.
Congrats.
But there's also been, what do we call it? Like a media kerfuffle because Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg had a child with his partner. I think that they adopted, I believe. We can confirm. But he took paternity leave as part of bringing the child home, which is, increasingly a normal thing and should be. But it turned into, I guess, a media storm having conversations about paternity leave and what is acceptable and all of these things, and was just, a brief blight on the timeline. And as part of that, conversation that was emerging, there was a thread that came from Ezra Klein that reminded me of a a woman, Dr. Alison Gopnik, who's written a bunch of books, is sort of like a developmental psychologist and writes a lot about parenting and does studies about parenting and things like that. And in the conversation, it was talking about parental leave and what men are losing by not having these opportunities for paternal care. The trend is increasingly that companies and even now states are providing the opportunity for caregiving leave on both sides of the equation. Increased leave for mothers is the trend line, but also for fathers or non-birthing caregivers for like non-cishet couples to be able to spend time early in the child's lives to bond. In some cases, it's called bonding leave, I believe. And the big thing that came up in this conversation was around those care opportunities, in part because Alison Gopnik talks a lot about, the way that Ezra Klein had summarized this was, we don't just care for others because we love them because we perform acts of care for them, which is, he's paraphrasing Alison Gopnik. And I've heard her talk a lot of times, and I really relate to her perspective on parenting, but it's made me think a lot about the norms that we hold culturally and what our expectations of our dads. In some ways, the fact that there are low expectations, right? That, the sort of cultural caricature of a dad, I think the expectations are low. That, they like, whether it's like they just like sit on the couch and watch sports and like go to work and aren't good at things, or it's that they're cold, or, even in media, we have sort of like the bad dad and the good dad and sort of not a lot of models in between. And so my question for y'all, as sort of like what we see in culture and what sort of in a shifting perspective in the world around sort of confronting outdated norms about masculinity, about parenting, about the roles of male parents, is, what do we want from a dad?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. In the past, I guess 20 years, I've seen a big difference. But like we mentioned earlier before the show, I had a little different upbringing, especially in a part of the country that is maybe a little behind and still sees, like you were talking about, the old notions of what a dad should be. You go to work, come home, sit on the couch, watch TV, go to bed. My father was disabled when I was young. He retired, then came home, and my mother went to work. She basically took over what at the time, like, cultural role of what a father figure is. Goes to work, comes home, goes to bed. Didn't really see much of her during that time, but I got really close with my dad, and it was really interesting because my dad is especially from a time when my dad grew up in the 60s and 70s in the South, when those roles were even more kind of enhanced. So it was really interesting to see from his perspective him take on those kind of like new roles and play Mr. Mom. And it was just really, I think there is a lot changing. I think, he probably wasn't too happy about it at first, but I think dads can be, like, the idea of a stay-at-home dad, I think, is normalizing a lot more. Well, I think you will start to see it more.
Well, it's really interesting, even in how you spoke about it right there, right? Like, the idea of Mr. Mom is the idea that the basis of caregiving as right? We've had, like, there's a movie called Mr. Mom, right, with Michael Keaton, I think, in the 80s. But it is saying, like, the basis of care exists within sort of a female construct, and that if a man is going to take on those duties, we will then he will like take on a name that is sort of orienting him towards that female construct, right? It is a man playing the woman's role. Go ahead, Jess.
Then again, I mean, I'm saying this knowing that you are the only person on air who's a parent that I know of. But that said, what I think is really interesting is that this construct is a thing, yet it's not like most moms know more than the dad about being a parent before they become a parent. And it's so interesting how powerful that construct can be, despite the fact that the baseline is actually pretty equivalent. The likelihood of, having any tremendous leg up is negligible.
Are you saying that you think women do or don't have more prior knowledge?
I don't. Why would they? Unless you have been culturally deeply exposed to that by the setup of your community. I think there are a lot of, at least in the US, there are not that many people who grew up with their entire family unit around to maybe learn a certain thing. I don't know. I guess, but like, why would you as a young girl learn anything more than a young boy on the subject of parenting?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because in my case, I'm the oldest of 4 kids, so I had a lot more experience with young children, and I have like a lot of cousins. I had a lot of caretaking responsibilities growing up, and Becky didn't have those experiences. Her cousins weren't living close by. Her brother's only like a year and a half younger than her. And so I actually had a lot more caretaking experience growing up than she did. And so, oftentimes there was not as like a qualitative judgment, but like it was oftentimes when we were encountering something new with our own child, it was like I had some experience that at least hinted at the new thing that we were endeavoring into, and I could be sort of like the calming force because it was like, I at least had an idea of what we were entering into. Like, you can't prepare for when the kid is your own and you're with them all the time, and they are now your like full-time responsibility. And also, I think we've mentioned on air before, like there are lots of studies in animals that have sort of extended adolescence, like blue jays, as an example, will stay in the nest for 2 years often. And so they'll have you'll come up, and then the next year you'll still be living with the blue jays will still be living with their parents, but there'll be a new nestling in the nest. Mm-hmm. And so they actually help take care of that nestling. And blue jays that had caretaking opportunities for like younger sibling nestlings actually have higher success of the survival rate of their offspring.
Families of 5 or more know that this is how it works. If you're still around, you're helping out.
I'm very torn though on this, because I feel like I definitely agree it's very situational. Like, it just kind of comes from your upbringing. Anybody could experience anything. I don't really think it really gender plays that big of a role. But then at the same time, I do kind of think maybe just in women's education, what they learn growing up, either from their mothers or other things that are specific to women that they have to deal with throughout their lives, I think maybe provides them some kind of additional information. But I don't know. Like, that could just be my preconceived notions. I don't know enough.
Maybe information or priming, like the fact that, again, perpetuated by like cultural stereotyping and norms, like young girls are given dolls to play with. Like, take care of a child instead of, I mean, not like they are, but versus a young boy not given similar nurturing play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting though, like, right, there's sort of a decrease overall in the average number of children that families are having. Mm-hmm. Part of that is an increase in the number of couples who are choosing, or individuals who are choosing not to have children overall. But it also means that there is more attention and focus on a fewer number of children at home, fewer relationships to develop, things like that. Coinciding with that is an overall increase in total time investment by parents in their children, which is sort of surprising. There are studies that show that modern, or contemporary mothers that are living right now who are working are actually spending more time in childcare than historical mothers did who were stay-at-home parents.
Yeah.
And so the idea of both increases in time investment and reductions of available time, it is coinciding with fewer children. And this idea of like that they bring up that Alison Gopnik references and Ezra Klein is referencing is the ability to have a relationship with your child begins in those early moments, and that a lot of people are missing those opportunities because of a cultural perception of what it means to be a dad, right? Like on a fundamental level, if as a society we're setting an expectation that dads are useless, and the number of times that I've heard people tell me that dads are useless until a kid is 2 or until a kid is a year or whatever, like so many people have said that to me. And while you're sort of like, babies are useless when they're that age, they're not like playing, you can't do a lot with them, but it's sort of setting the expectation that like the care moments belong to the mother and the like play moments belong to the dad. Like that's like sort of like one cultural archetype that we have is like dads will tire the kids out and then bring them back to the mom to like feed them or care for them or whatever, or they'll come home in roughhouse. And like, not to say that those things aren't fun and you can't do those things too, but we're sort of like boxing men out through conceptions of their role by both setting the bar low, but by setting the bar low in a way that closes them out from being able to have sort of like richer, more nuanced relationships with their children.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about earlier, the women who are working more or more involved with their career are spending more time with their kids in the beginning. I think that's what you said.
More hours, more care hours in the day.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's really interesting is that it used to, like, that idea that just women in general, I think, are working more today and they're more educated. More women go to college than men now. Women are like way more involved in like their careers than what used to be, maybe in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever. And I think that's like a really big, unless men are going to college, there's a big problem about, a lot of men are choosing not to go to college, aren't getting as educated, aren't getting in as big as careers. And I think like that's huge for like why those roles might be flopping too.
Yeah, well, and this is why my reaction to that article was like a little bristly, because when I read it, I was like, or at least not article, the Twitter thread it was, right? And I read it and I was like, I read it again and I was like, it's kind of annoying how the whole framing of this conversation is around like men and dads should like choose to be more involved and like pick up more of those responsibilities because it's good. And it's like, yeah, but like also like dads, get your act together, like step it up. It's not like why it's like, oh, you're the victim, it's so hard for you to like see that this is valuable. It's like, yo, all these other people are like, picking up your slack, get on your business, dads.
Yeah, well, everyone seems to think.
Go ahead, Jim.
Everyone seems to think that, like, especially of women, like, you either have to focus on your career or be a mother. Like, you can't have both. And I think we're starting to see that maybe, like, with this discussion, too, of men. Like, you can't have both. Like, why is it so unreasonable to have both? If Pete Buttigieg wants to take paternity leave, let him take paternity leave. It's not a big deal. I understand, regardless of your political affiliations, that he's in a big role for the country. But what was going on at the time was completely out of his hands, honestly. I mean, and he's a figurehead. They have so many more people taking care of things that people don't realize. He just totally got scapegoated on that whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it is this idea of setting the expectation and social stigma within these things, right? I think I mentioned before, like, I can't tell you anyone that I knew who had taken paternity leave before, like, 2015. Granted, I was at a different life stage and wasn't, didn't have, like, a lot of peer relationships with people who were having children in New York City. But paternity leave sort of came onto the scene in the United States pretty quickly. It started at 2 weeks and sort of rapidly has increased since then. And what was an exception when we rolled out as a company a paternity leave policy quickly became sort of outdated, right? Like, we were early to introduce it as a company, and then within a short period of time, our paternity policy seemed like paltry, right? It was 2 weeks when we introduced it, and the movement towards paternity leave has like come in, faster than a lot of things, like almost anything that I can think of. If you're talking about like the change where entire states are instituting laws that are requiring employers to make available some sort of paternity leave policy, and increasing obviously maternity leave or parental leave, caregiver leave. Again, I don't want to make this only like a cisgendered hetero thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, but then again, I think confronting the gender binary is partially where this is most pointy,
exactly.
Right? Like, there isn't the cultural expectation when you have two parents of the same or non-binary gender. It's like, okay, then there isn't an expectation, so we have to negotiate that on our own, versus specifically this, which I think it just goes without saying. It's like, the reason that this is a thing with dads is because it is part of the cultural baggage of the binary.
Yeah, and of this stigma of like masculinity, and like it's a very generational thing, right? Like, I guess it's not surprising maybe that with like, as millennials are increasingly in parental age or well into parental age, that this policy is shifting, because there was a pretty significant gender mindset shift within that generation, and continues, like, as these things do. Gen Z seems to be even a step further in sort of breaking down the gender binary. But a lot of this, while we push in the sort of conversation about the gender binary, this idea of what it means to be a dad seems to persist longer or in different ways, I think, than some of the other ideas that seem to be moving faster, of like, what is your role? What is your responsibility? Like, what do we want from a father? And part of me feels like it is like a media, film, culture construct, because the models are so narrow. And I guess, I mean, I don't know, like, can y'all think of relatively recent depictions of fathers that feel like it starts to break out of that, like, sort of narrow field of what it means to be a dad? I mean, I'm sure there are, but I can't think of something that sort of like pointed it out. You got something, Chandler?
Yeah, well, I had a couple things, but I'll answer your question first. I think it's like, every time you see a father depicted in a movie, at least what I've noticed, what I just kind of thought about, it's either who's like has maybe a more involved role in their child's life, or more of like a caregiver. It's usually a comedy, or there's some sort of tragedy involved where the mother is like out of the picture. It's never just like this is how our family dynamic works. It's just something. They're either making fun of the dynamic, or again, tragedy, which is it. I don't understand. Again, why can't there be both? Like, why can't you be a good father? Like, why is it so weird to say that loving your child is unmasculine or caring for your child is unmasculine? And that gets back to the point too, where like, what even is masculinity, and should that even be the word used anymore?
I am wondering about that. I think, and I'm specifically thinking about Moana, because the emphasis is very much on Moana's father, and hardly her mother. And it's not really a tragedy or even particularly a toxic relationship. If anything, it's like her dad expects a lot of her, wants her to be, take on a lot of responsibility on the island and succeed him in the throne, and yet also really wants to protect her and doesn't know how to navigate that relationship as she's growing up. I don't know. I wonder if is that sort of the best example of our changing relationship. It's not necessarily as it's not maybe not as progressive, but maybe an accurate representation of the type of grappling we're going through.
Yeah, there was as y'all were talking, and Moana is interesting because it's like it fits in like a fairy tale construct, which is sort of distinct, but the gender dynamics of it are still super interesting, where it's like she's being treated as both like a son and a daughter simultaneously.
Right. She's like exactly.
But the tragedy thing, did either of you see Fatherhood? It was on Netflix. It's like a new Kevin Hart movie that is like predicated around his wife dies immediately after the baby is born. This is not a spoiler. It's like in the trailers.
This is like every movie also, but okay.
Yeah,
continue.
She has like a pulmonary embolism or something like that after childbirth, which is like a thing, and she dies, and he's like having to raise a child, and the whole thing is like in some ways both confronting this idea that like a dad can't be a good dad or like
a good parent.
You can't be raised only by a dad, because dads don't know what they're doing, and like mothers are great, and also plays like sort of confirms it like right, like it's like both challenging the concept and also confirming it, that like he doesn't know what he's doing, and the whole time he's like, you need a mother, and then he's like succeeding and they're doing okay, but even when he's succeeding, he's still feeling like he's inadequate. And so it was an interesting, like it was a good movie. I enjoyed it. Tearjerker. I would recommend watching it. And also it's like, even that is like trying to challenge the concept, but is like only kind of going halfway there, of like, obviously being a right. single parent would be a terrible experience for anyone. But it's like, so much of it is like based on the idea that like, well, if you're going to have a single parent, it'd be better to have a mom than a dad, because dads are dum-dums.
And the only scenario where this would ever happen of such a step up is if some horrible Saint Mother tragedy occurs and they are forced into the situation.
Have either of you seen Manchester by the Sea?
I couldn't watch it. I was like, this sounds so sad. I'm not like...
It is... For some reason, I like torturing myself with watching really sad movies. And it's something about like feeling sad on a Saturday night gets me going. I don't know. But no, so it's about this father... I don't want to spoil anything, but a father who lost his family, and now he's taking care of his nephew after his father passed away from a heart. He had like congenital heart failure, and that's what I was thinking about the whole tragedy thing. It's like the father figure, whoever that may be, is just thrown into this horrible situation and is like trying to navigate it and has no idea what the hell he's doing, but is also dealing with all other, kind of things in his life. And it is really interesting because you can tell, like, there's a lot of backstory about how the guy has tragedy, so it might not be the best example, but he does like how he tries to be that figure to his nephew, and he struggles with it, and I don't know, it's just really interesting from a standpoint of that. It seems like we were talking about, that situation would never occur naturally, like we're saying. There always has to be some external factor for a father to be placed in a situation where he's the sole caregiver.
Well, there's have either of you watched Scenes from a Marriage?
Oh, is that the one with Adam Driver and Scarlett Johansson?
No, that's Marriage Story. Scenes from a Marriage is
way too similar.
Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain. It was based on, it's a miniseries, like 5 parts, based on an Ingmar Bergman 1973 Swedish TV miniseries, apparently.
Okay.
And I only watched 2 episodes. I was working from my desk in my room, and my wife was watching it, and then I just slowly got sucked in. But I will tell you, it is like a train wreck ride.
Oh no!
I watched it 2 weeks ago, the 2 episodes, and it is still. This is why I don't watch these sad, intense things, because I'm still thinking about it all the time, and my wife has completely moved on. She's it was sad. She was crying when she watched it. And then,
in what way?
It is just emotionally wrought in if you've ever had a bad breakup or been in a relationship that's has problems, it is super triggering.
Oh man.
But the beginning of the show starts with them sitting on a couch. Again, this is not a spoiler. It's the opening scene of them sitting on a couch because Oscar Isaac is an academic and taking on primary caregiving duties during the week because his wife is working long hours. She's an executive in the tech industry and traveling and doing things like that. So, but even in this, where they're sort of confronting these gender dynamics of the roles, implicit as the show goes on is this sort of that relationship with reverse gender dynamics is unhealthy or unhappy or sort of unnatural. And I haven't finished the series, so maybe it flips that back, right? But in watching the first 2 episodes, which are individual movies almost, it is it feels it's almost making a statement, whether intentionally or not, that being in a situation where a man is a primary caregiver and a woman is a primary breadwinner, and even the interview from the academic is sort of hinting at these ideas.
Then I guess, is that the thing that we want from dads? Is it just that we want to be able to see more examples of different ways of playing roles in their
successfully
in their kids' lives without being under duress or facing some other kind of extraordinary circumstance? What is the thing that we need to see more in movies of dad's behavior?
It feels we know that the effect that media has on us, right? Of both sort of presenting us scenes that we would aspire to both individually as well as looking for in a partner, right? Whether or not that is the right way to do it, you're sort of drawing models from your personal life and from media models and things like that to say what does a successful partnership look like? What does a successful parenting look like? And if you're not seeing aspirational models of an alternative to traditional parenting dynamics, then the sort of entry into caregiving in early phases of parenthood feels like probably scary or threatening to someone who is like starting to do that and worried about sort of their like comfort in their gender identity or something like that. You know, I don't know.
I mean, parenting's hard. Like, no, I mean, I'm nowhere near a parent and don't plan to be anytime soon, hopefully. But I mean, you see people like, I mean, I have friends now who are parents. I watched my parents. Like, it's hard. Raising children is hard. I don't think anyone has an advantage over anyone else in terms of who's better, whether that be if it's two men together, two women together, a man and a woman. It doesn't matter. Like, raising a child, especially today, is just extremely, extremely difficult. The best thing that I think could come out of it when we're talking about from culture is just get rid of those caricatures and stereotypes and just show. I mean, it sounds like, that scenes from a marriage thing, like you were talking about, was kind of being there's a lot of turmoil that goes into being in a relationship with someone and trying to raise a kid. Like, that's extremely hard. And then, now that I'm done with that rant, I did have a question that popped up in my mind. Do either of you know, do primates in the wild, when a baby is born, do they stay with the mother, and how long? Does anyone know? That's a very specific question.
It varies by species.
Joey would know.
But there are also like interesting mirror dynamics in certain primate species that you see that sort of mirror the ways that the things we see in teenage years with children getting in fights with their mothers. Where
amazing.
Children will cling to, like, primate babies will cling to their mother for a really long time and will continue to cling to her until eventually the mothers start getting like pissed off and mean to the children at some point when they get old enough. And it just, like, I remember learning about that in college, like the behavioral dynamic, and being like, oh, that's why my mom and my sister are fighting so much.
Like, get off my leg.
Yeah, like, stop staying close. Like, it wasn't that my sisters were clinging. It's like they were close, but then they start asserting themselves while being really close to you. And it's like, no, you're in my space and you're not a baby anymore. Like, I don't want you this close to me. And they, like, primates, like chimpanzees, like, high primates will still, like, be, like, start, like, smacking their children and, like, whooping their ass. And they're like,
whoa,
give me some space. And that actually becomes, like, a moment where they like, start exploring more and branching out and forming, like, extra familial relationships and things like that.
I guess I was, like, kind of I had this weird thought in mind, because I think about evolution a lot, like the kind of evolutionary traits that are still stuck with us that are maybe hard to break just from however many tens of thousands of years in the making they were. But, like, this is going to sound really weird. I wonder what would happen if you had a way to do some sort of study to where a newborn, if they could recognize their father or mother and, like, who they would naturally gravitate towards just based on, like,
super the mom.
10,000 years of, like, in the past, the reason I asked about primates is, like, they're our closest evolutionary relatives. But
it's super the mom. They can recognize the mother's voice when they're born because they can hear aspects of the tones inside of the body.
Right. And I guess I wonder if it's like, there is some sort of natural subconscious inclination we have to gravitate towards mothers or mother figures for certain things that, like, we kind of don't have
because under, like, hyper traditional context, it's like they both birthed you and then are feeding you immediately. Like, they're the source of nutrition and care. And because of how we evolved, the first 3 months of child, like, post birth is like sometimes called the fourth trimester, because babies are so useless because we've evolved to be like extreme K-type animals where parents like the amount of time that parents are like responsible for taking care of their children is like 18 years. Like no other animal like takes care of their offspring even like proximate to that amount of time. We're like just useless lumps forever. We have like such an extended development period.
Really inspiring.
Yeah.
And I also know for a fact and from like near to firsthand experience that now that that mothers are not the only source of food and care for babies, like you can almost have the exact opposite effect where like whoever is the primary caretaker of the child becomes, you know, whoever feeds them the most, that's the person, regardless. You know, like I only want the person who gives me the food. Where's that? Find me that person, and also bring them within a couple inches of my face because I can't recognize them too far away.
It's funny, you develop different like dynamics. Like I definitely have like a big role in Emerson's life, and I'm still like a far number 2, and I do a lot of shit. Like, and eventually like
a far number 2, a lot of shit.
Yeah. You know, like if she gets hurt or something like that, sometimes she'll turn to me because I'm out with her outside more, and like in instances where she gets hurt and like for playing and things like that, she'll turn to me. You begin to like develop sort of like your jobs, and I feed her a lot, but also like, you know, so it's like different things like emerge, but you don't get that opportunity. I'll tell you the one piece of advice, which I said before the show, was the input. Did I talk about the inputs and outputs thing on here already? That is like I heard these economists that are a couple talk in 2012, which is like also like the nerdy version of me is like, that's the parental advice. Like economists talking in economist terms is how I'm going to, but they were like, naturally, in economist terms, we talked about it of she takes care of inputs and I take care of outputs. And I was like, oh, like, that's easy. Like, distributed responsibility. Like, I have a job. Like, if I know I have a job, then I'll do that. And so if I was ever around when Emerson was, like, before she was potty trained or whatever, if I was there, I was taking care of diaper changes, right? And then you sort of, like, start to expand out, but by having that responsibility, it's like, there's a thing, I can take care of that. Like I can sort of assert myself into this dynamic. I know where my place is, and you can start to expand out. So for any dads or soon to be dads or considering dads or non-like birthing partners, inputs and outputs is a good model.
Joey, I think you just turned me off from having kids. I was really, I was amped to have a couple kids one day, but I don't know if I want to be in charge of outputs.
Yeah.
How do I get a different gig?
Yeah, they potty train eventually.
But 3 years is a long time.
Yeah, but then you keep wiping their butt after for a while, so that's gross. Anyways, Jess, this brings us up to our wrap-up corner. I think, can you solve a major societal problem in an elevator pitch?
What do we want from dads? Many things, but not necessarily more of all of the things that we wanted from them before. We want to have higher expectations of dads. So.
Also, dads need to step up.
Yeah, dads need to step up, but let's not constrain what a dad can be to a narrow window of things.
To all our dads listening, get it together.
God.
Even if you're doing a good job, do better.
There's always room.
Joey's like, what if there's just more space? And we're like, no, do more, Dad.
No. And Dad, if you're listening, you do better too. I'll see you for Christmas.
Yeah. I'm doing great. So this is about everyone else except for me, naturally.
Naturally.
Palate cleanser. We're back. Easy. That was like light reading. Gentle topics about foundational societal structures and concepts. Easy. Let's get to something a little bit more serious. Chandler, what do you want to talk to us about?
Well, Joey, today I'll go ahead and give you the old question, and then we'll talk about why.
You're gonna mix it up.
I'm gonna mix it up.
The question.
All right. I feel like this is my. I don't know how many of these I'm gonna get. I got to make an impression, right? So the question is, how should companies be held accountable? Little open-ended there. Could be about a few different things. But the way this came about was, a couple of ways. So firstly, most recently, I've been reading this book by author Matt Taibbi, who is also a writer for Rolling Stone. Mm-hmm. And it's called
For the Rolling Stones.
Rolling Stones.
A writer for the Rolling Stones. Sorry.
Yeah, they actually did a mashup. So the book is about basically how the wealth gap in America has created a structure where greater injustice, because large-scale corporations, mainly financial services institutions, have become so big and powerful that they are untouchable by the hand of the law. And your everyday Joe, somebody walking down the street, in the book they particularly talk about how minorities and low-income people are thrown in jail for the littlest things, yet massive companies can go off on tirades and basically cripple economies and no one goes to jail. And there's so many legal protections and blocks to keep these companies afloat, to keep their executives out of jail, that it's created this really unjust system. So let me ask the question, well, how do we hold companies accountable? We can't, they're incorporated. We can't treat them like people. We can't send a company to jail. So what are we going to do about this?
So the question is sort of, it's interesting because I had mentioned to you when you brought this topic up, we had talked in the opening of the most recent Off-White paper about Citizens United as sort of like a particularly important decision for a lot of reasons, right? It's changed the way that money plays in politics, but it's also sort of because of companies' abilities to participate in politics, sort of begun to shift our expectations generationally of what are we expecting from companies, how they need to participate, what is their role, do they need to take stances on issues, it needs to be more than just a PR statement. It needs to be they need to be taking actions. Are they demonstrating that they're taking actions? Companies can be canceled in the ways that individuals can be canceled, all of those conversations. But I think what's interesting as you're expanding on this is not about how do we hold companies accountable, what are our expectations of them? And while Citizens United maybe is still relevant in this conversation, you're sort of, it sounds like you're more explicitly talking about what is almost like the penal code, right? What are the sort of sticks that can be used, or incentives or disincentives in a system to penalize negative behavior. Is that right?
Yeah, to an extent. It just, what got me so sort of riled up about this, and it's something I wrote about in one of the newsletters a few weeks ago, about how companies kind of
the progress report newsletter.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
So companies and executives, like you said, are taking stances on things, but it's turned into this sort of hypocritical, moral grandstanding where, a lot of these companies can say, Jamie Dimon, for example, from JP Morgan. He's the head of JP Morgan throughout the whole financial crisis. He's basically the face of that bank. took a picture of him taking a knee with some bank employees and posted it saying, he supported the Black Lives Matter movement and all of JP Morgan does, which is great. But a lot of their practices in the past, especially in 2008 and post 2008, had a lot of financial policies that indiscriminately targeted, or I guess indiscriminately is the right word. It targeted minority communities, lower incomes, and took advantage of those. Their financial policies, especially in commodities trading and Goldman Sachs did this too, and driving up the price of gas, which disproportionately affects lower income people. They had predatory lending policies that disproportionately targeted these minorities and lower income people. So it's like, instead of yelling at someone on Twitter, how are we going to make sure they're actually not doing horrible things? And unfortunately, I feel like it has to come down to some sort of legal backlash, because I don't think fining them or canceling them on Twitter is enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen in some boycott movements and things like that is that it can have a legitimate impact on companies, but the sustaining of those movements is often difficult, right? Like, how do you keep a large group of people to have sort of sustained focus and attention on a particular behavior when, things move on, whether it's in the news cycle or whatever? That the penalty of it, even sort of a flare-up, can be a legitimate financial penalty, which is certainly a disincentive for bad behavior, but is not maybe a significant enough disincentive to necessitate large-scale systemic change within these organizations. But the flip side of this is that we're sort of sitting in a political place where there's largely a stalemate, right? From congressional perspective, the two parties aren't particularly working together. And so even when you're saying, what is the what is the legal backlash? It feels difficult to imagine that some large scale legal backlash, or which would require a changing of existing laws, is going to pop up. And so it still does somehow feel like it requires social movements to be the sort of leading impetus for that change. And I think social movements can be any number of things. It can be an activistic movement. I think the reality is there are also sort of conscious capitalistic movements that take place, right, where it's sort of operating within the capitalistic system to sort of create options that have sort of more idealized approaches, business practices, but those are, in all of those cases, they're slow movements.
Yeah. Well, I think
the stick is still not very big.
Yeah, I think, let me backtrack for a second, because I said there's kind of two ways to look at it, right? There's when companies do things that are maybe technically legal, but morally questionable, or kind of, break our boundaries of what we hold dear about their values. I don't know what I'm trying to say. That messed that up. But, and then, those are the times where we want companies to take a stand, or we might, have some sort of social activist movement. But then there are times when companies actually do illegal things and they get away with it. And this is what this book is about, in that they have become so big and so powerful and have such an impact on our economy that they get away with it. There's no way to hold them accountable for the illegal things that they did. And a lot of this goes back to a memo that Eric Holder wrote in 1999 about collateral consequence. Now, you might know collateral consequence better as too big to fail, because that's what it morphed into. And this is a legal memo. He's he used to be the attorney general under the Barack Obama presidency. Very smart man, but this letter, he wrote this memo to kind of help people, but it actually ended up hurting people against his intentions. But that led us to too big to fail. And, when some of these companies like a Goldman Sachs or a Coca-Cola or, these GE, these massive multinational companies get so big that when they do mess up, there's really no way to hold them accountable other than fining. And while these social activist movements, I think, are great, I mean, there was, Coca-Cola says, or not Coca-Cola, but a lot of these brands say they love to hear or love to support these movements, but a lot of their international business practices don't really live up to that. And so it's and they'll put on a front or a face for people, but in practice, not that much really changes. So it's how do we help change that?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is sort of like a question of transparency, right? Like what do you say versus what do you do? I've heard all of these ads that get served, whether it's on like podcasts or things like that, about like ExxonMobil is investing in the energy of the future, and they're like, we're making considerable investments in like wind and hydrogen and all blah blah blah. And I saw something Vox Explained has like a new season out on Netflix, and I was watching
such a great show.
Yeah, I was watching the one about oil, and they were talking about like, yes, these companies are investing in alternatives, but like almost 99% or something crazy of their investment is actually just going into new fossil fuel technologies. And so it's like they can credibly say like that is not untrue that they are making those investments, but like most of the money is still going to like continued fossil fuel projects. And so that delta, right, like this is sort of the issue with like complete free market systems, is that like sometimes systems will completely run, like unchecked systems may like run in a cancerous direction, right? Like if you viewed like a free market system like your body, occasionally things happen within your body that you need to regulate with external forces, such as cancer, where a particular force, mechanism, system begins sort of proliferating in a direction that you don't want it to. And so you go in and excise that system, you take, chemotherapy or radiation to irradiate it, but you're changing the dynamics in which your body is functioning. And I think that's what we're talking about in a lot of these systems, is like, even if there is sort of a consumer will to, purchase things of a certain nature, right? Like when we're talking about like sustainable energy or more sustainable products, like there is sort of like currently a customer orientation, an increasing customer orientation towards purchasing those products, but there's not necessarily an equivalent incentive for companies to be producing those things. And so the question becomes, do you regulate them, right? Like in the infrastructure bill that's coming through Congress right now, there was that policy around incentivizing energy companies within the United States to like up, 4% if they were or incentivizing them if they were achieving 4% reduction in carbon output every year, and penalizing them if they weren't. But that is like slowly may now actually be completely out of the bill. And so you need sort of external forces to jump in some way. The question is like, where is it going to come from? Mm-hmm. Does that bring us to our wrap-up corner? Can you wrap this up?
No, I can't.
We need hall monitors.
Capitalism. Here's what I've got. Capitalism, a system designed to incentivize business to happen, is also vulnerable to cancerous lesions that can make it really difficult to do
affect change from non-systemic places.
There we go.
That sounds right. I buy that.
It was very poetic. Was that James Joyce?
Yeah, it was.
And it devolved at the end.
We did it. Just another light episode in the can here at Critical Nonsense.
I'm glad I could been a part of maybe the happiest episode that's ever come out.
Well, we are at minimum happy to have had you. Thanks, Chandler.
Oh, that was cute. Thanks, Jess.
Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Brought to you by Mr. G, Kenneth's father.
Kenneth's father, Mr. G. As always, we'd like to thank executive producer, and could be Mrs. G if she plays her card right, Jess Vander.
What? Remove.
You marrying Kenny G sounded funny. We'd also like to thank our special guest and smooth operator, Chandler Saunders.
It was a pleasure.
I have to thank sound engineer and hoodwind of our hearts, Alex Contel.
And we'd like to thank our programming coordinator and magician, like, you know, the David Copperfield of this operation, Les Jacobs.
I'd just like to thank Sarah and Nora for your production help. And nerf hurting if I were here.
Yeah, nerf hurting. And as always, thanks, Ellen.
Sorry, Ellen.
Special thanks. We got some special thanks this week. Chandy?
Oh, do I have a special
Chandy?
thanks?
Yeah, do you have any special thanks? I'm doing special thanks to the nickname Chandy, which is going to maybe be permanent now.
Yeah, a lot of people call me that, so I'm okay with that. I'd like to give a special thanks to my mom, my dad, Joey, Jess, and Alex for having me on this wonderful production.
Your parents for having you on the production.
Yeah.
I would like to thank Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain for ruining a couple days of my life with something that was so beautiful and terrible that I can't actually finish watching the series. But, like, props, like, to the people who made that show, good job and fuck you.
Well, language, Joey. I'd also like to thank Lin-Manuel Miranda for creating a very boppin' soundtrack to Moana.
Have you seen Vivo yet?
No?
It is a Lin-Manuel Miranda musiced and acted film on Netflix about a kinkajou in Cuba, and Emerson likes it and the soundtrack. You could say she bounces to the beat of her own drum.
Drummer?
Yeah. No, to the beat of her own drum. She's wow in a world full of ho-hum. You'll like it. You'll enjoy it. Vivo. That's it. Thanks.
That's it.
Thanks, Kinkajous.
Cool. Well,
thanks. Great Apes. Thanks for ape moms punching their children when they're teenagers. Thanks, Blue Jays. You know, just putting in the work. Co-parenting. And thank you all.
Adopters? Okay, yeah, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, adopters. Thank you, any caregivers. You are underappreciated.
For sure.
And undervalued and
Always.
put in so much work. And we're grateful to any caregivers out there of any age people.
Thank you to Target for delivering my new pillows today. I've been on a bed without pillows for the past 3 months.
A swift turn, but we are thankful.
Get it together, Chandler. A pillow-less bed for 3 months?
Yeah, it was a rough start to
Sounds really
my new
uncomfortable.
apartment. And, you know, it's all part of living in New York. Nothing goes according to plan.
Roll up a towel. Jeez.
Oh well, I had blankets. rolled
Bye,
out,
guys.
Well, that's the show. We did it.
but- Nice.
Goodbye. Love you.
Alex is like, well, what am I going to do with this?